Hello, you are all welcome to this online presentation. I will discuss The Mayor of Casterbridge by Thomas Hardy. Many of you know that Thomas Hardy was a Victorian writer. Victorian period began in the middle or the second quarter of the 19th century with the accession of Queen Victoria. And the entire latter part of the 19th century is Victorian period. Victorian period is known for many reasons. The time is known for the British Empire, its expansion, its trade, its commerce, its military power, naval power, and last but not least, literature. I'm sure many of you are quite well aware of the literary stalwarts of the time in poetry, in fiction, in children's writing, children's stories, detective fiction, so on and so forth, women writing, etc. Charles Dickens, Bronte sisters, Elizabeth Gaskell, or even one of the most popular writers of crime fiction, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. These writers all belong to the Victorian era. But then there is one more name which is almost equally important, and that name is Thomas Hardy. Thomas Hardy in our literature, English literature, is primarily known for his novels. A good many books he wrote in his long life. But Thomas Hardy should not be forgotten just as a fiction writer. He was a great poet too. Thomas Hardy was born in 1840 and he passed away in 1928. Therefore, he lived a long life and, of course, very fruitful life. The novels that we love to read of Thomas Hardy are not just Victorian, but they are also very much local. What do we understand by local novels? Local novels are the ones which are primarily and essentially concentrated on a certain topographical area, geographical area. Thomas Hardy chose this area, the area for his fiction writing, and that area is the southwestern part of Britain. He named this area Wessex. Now many of you know Wessex because in Anglo-Saxon period we first came across this name Wessex, the rise of Wessex, the house of Wessex, the great warrior king, King Alfred, who was a brilliant scholar and soldier from Wessex. But then in course of time, down the ages, people forgot the name Wessex because Wessex merged with other provinces and counties of England. Thomas Hardy only revived the name Wessex. He was born in Dorset, one of the southeastern counties of England, and Wessex is not just Dorset, but other counties like Cornwall or Sussex, etc. I mean, all the entire region, southwestern region, is Wessex. Like many other novels, The Mayor of Casterbridge is also located in that region. This is the first slide. You can see a man and a woman are walking the road. They are coming down. They are not looking at each other. The man is wearing village clothes. He is not carrying anything with him. It is just a dramatization of the story. The woman, who is none other than the man's wife, is carrying her baby girl. This is the first slide, The Mayor of Casterbridge, and this is the opening scene of the book, of the story. Thomas Hardy was, as I have said, Victorian poet and novelist, and he was born in 1840. This is the picture of Thomas Hardy, a great fellow. and he died in 1928. This is actually the map of Wessex. You see, this is the map of Wessex. Here, I'm sorry. This is the map, and here you have an old map, of course. Wessex. This is I cannot point at things, but this is a map. These dots are the English Channel and the bay, and the portion just at the middle of this map there is a place called Casterbridge. Now let us come to the brief biography of the man Thomas Hardy. His parentage. Now, Thomas Hardy was born at Upper Bockhampton. This is one place in Dorset. Dorset is actually county, and the capital, this town, or the most important town, is Dorchester. Dorchester is actually fictionalized under the name Casterbridge in our book. And his father was actually a master mason, and his mother was a very well learned and very judicious housewife, and she was to a large extent responsible for the upbringing of the child, and also the inculcation of literary as well as musical tastes in his mind. So the mother had, in this case, a very crucial role in the upbringing. Thomas Hardy had a special knack for music, and that was also because of his mother. Thomas Hardy when he was a little child, he was regularly told personal stories as well as lores by his mother, and as like any other child, Thomas Hardy had very deep impressions of these stories. His father was a mason, and therefore I think it had a great impact upon his career. He trained as an architect. He went to London too, and he was then for some time was thinking of becoming a great architect. He had this training, therefore he had good flair, a good skill of architecture, but he couldn't continue. In 1857, Hardy began to write poetry, and this skill of architecture was also there, very much alive at the back of his mind. But he was suggested, he was counseled by other people that, look, you give up architecture and then you took up literature very seriously, because you have that literary flair in you. And then he was in two minds. He couldn't decide which way to go, and he became assistant to Arthur Blomfield. This is the name, and who actually perhaps who could have changed his life to a large extent, and worked hard at his profession, but uncertain whether literature or architecture would be his path. And finally, he dropped the idea of literature, of architecture, of course, and he went to art galleries, concerts, and finally he started writing. He came back home, of course, because he needed a place, a secluded place for writing his novels. All his books are they have the backdrop of the southwestern England, Dorset and other counties. He fell ill at a time, in March 1865. His first prose work, Humorous Sketch, was published in one of the journals. Now, by the way, let me here add something that those were the days, or in even early Victorian period, most of the novels were published in serialized form. Serialized form means they were not published or printed in one single book when they were published for the first time, but they were published in installments. And most of the Victorian fictions, had good number of chapters. Even in this book, this Mayor of Casterbridge is a book of 45 chapters, 45 chapters, sometimes even over 50 chapters. Some of the books of Charles Dickens. So all these chapters cannot be printed in, can be, but cannot be sold perhaps with so much of success in one volume. Therefore, the magazine editors, they prefer to print those stories chapter by chapter. And finally, when all the chapters were complete, they would bring up the book in one volume or in multiple volumes. So he fell ill, and he recovered again. I mean, this illness couldn't take off the spirit of the writer from him, and therefore he came round and he started writing once again. Now here, when he started writing novels, but before writing his novels, in fact, in 1870, Hardy took Meredith's advice. Meredith was another Victorian writer, too literally, in fact, and wrote a novel which was all plot and which was published in 1871 under the title Desperate Remedies. I think the book was not a great success. In 1872 appeared his next novel, Under the Greenwood Tree. This was actually rather a far better writing, in which Hardy found himself and which he never surpassed in delicate perfection of it. And then came another book, A Pair of Blue Eyes. Meanwhile, Thomas Hardy married a lady whom he was courting for some times and who just actually infatuated Thomas Hardy. So they decided to marry. In 1874, Hardy married Emma Lavinia Gifford. His first popular success was Far from the Madding Crowd, 1874, which is an unquestioned masterpiece. In fact, many of the books are a masterpiece. For some time after his marriage, Hardy and his wife wandered about Europe and England like vagabonds, with nothing but boxes of books and bookcase besides their clothes. His wife was also very much instrumental in his writing career. So they had their share of travel, and at length they settled at a place, in a villa with a wide view of natural splendor of meadows, streams, brooks, etc., with songs of birds. So these are quite frequent reflections in almost every book of Thomas Hardy. Thomas Hardy then again, when his from the first publications onward, one thing must be borne in mind, that he was a man of controversies. He wrote things which were perhaps not quite palatable in the Victorian, according to Victorian taste and decorum. Therefore, many publishers perhaps didn't want to publish many of the sections, one of the parts of Thomas Hardy's books, stories. So they asked him to just replace them. Anyway, he went on, and his name was actually being noticed for quite some time. But the poor fellow had an unsuccessful married life. His marriage couldn't click outwardly. I mean, apparently Hardy seemed to live a tranquil and successful life. He had success, etc. But there was an unrest beneath the peaceful surface. his professional life was overshadowed by what at last became his wife's virtual insanity, her madness. In the latter years, she became a victim of kind of delusions. Among them, the conviction that she had married such much beneath her parental status, because the girl or the wife of Thomas Hardy, after all, didn't have the approval of her parents. Her public behavior was also sometimes very improper. So all these things eventually resulting into the death of her actually left Thomas Hardy devastated. So Mrs. Hardy passed away, you can say unexpectedly, in 1912, and Hardy was with her at the time of her death. She never regained consciousness after a quarrel, actually. A feeling of remorse, regret, grief, because after all, Thomas Hardy married entirely of his own convictions, and so it left a deep trench in his heart, remorse and grief, etc. He found himself finally wrapped with. So marriage didn't click, but he married for the second time in 1940. Her name was Florence Emily Dugdale, a charming girl, much younger than him, and a personal secretary of Thomas Hardy. So this marriage was fairly successful. He wrote some of his lyrical poetry and walked on his personal memories. So that is how he married for the second time. And then when the First World War broke out in 1914, this event, of course the event was quite earth-shaking in history. The First World War left again a very important mark in his mind and in his writings. His visits to the German and English wounded soldiers lying a few hundred yards apart in two Dorchester hospitals affected him deeply. So he became alert, and he also composed a good number of poems on this World War. Thomas Hardy died in 1928, 11th January, and when he passed away, his loss was really felt, because he was a unique figure in the Edwardian period and the late Victorian period. There was no match for him in the literary domain. You can say he was the last of the great Victorians. His ashes were buried in Westminster Abbey, Poet Corner, but in consideration of his deep affection and love for native Wessex, because he always loved his native place, native country, his heart was actually cut out from his body and was transported to Wessex or Dorset, where it was laid permanently. So this is by and large a very brief biography of Thomas Hardy. Now let us come to the Mayor of Casterbridge. The title itself gives you some idea of the story. The story is about a man who is the mayor of a place, Casterbridge. What is his name? His name is Michael Henchard. He is the main character of the book, Michael Henchard, protagonist. So here you have the list of characters. You have Michael Henchard, the mayor. The entire story revolves around Michael Henchard. It is his rise, his emotions, his experiences in personal life, how he handled the different circumstances which came his way, his personal life, his personal grief, and the people who came directly in contact with Michael Henchard. Michael Henchard's daughter, Elizabeth Jane. This is the second character. Of course, here we need to remember that Michael Henchard's real daughter, also by that name, passed away even much earlier. So this Elizabeth Jane is only a stepdaughter of Michael Henchard. Susan is wife of Michael Henchard, and her life is really pathetic because she's a victim of a moment's fury and frenzy of Michael Henchard. Michael Henchard, the mayor of Casterbridge, actually auctions her off, sells her to a stranger. So Susan's life is perhaps the most pathetic in the story. Donald Farfrae is a Scotsman. He's a young man. He's from Scotland. He comes to Dorset. He befriends Michael Henchard, and then a time comes in his life when he surpasses Michael Henchard in money and in wealth. And Farfrae is actually a reason why Henchard sees his gloomy days, his downfall. Lucetta, Michael Henchard's second love, a French woman and intriguing character, of course. Lucetta also passes away quite unexpectedly, almost in the latter half of the story. Job is a local rustic character, and there are other rustic characters also, but he plays some role in the story. He comes for a job to Michael Henchard, and so on and so forth. Formative woman's character is very brief in this story. Formative means a kind of drink, kind of a gruel kind of drink, which kind of intoxicant, which is often drunk with intoxicant, other liquors and beverages. This woman was indirectly responsible for the major turn of the story, and that turn is the selling of the wife of Michael Henchard. The formative woman reappears again in the story and reveals the secret of Michael Henchard, and that actually that secret, the revelation, leaves Michael Henchard quite devastated. Newson is the person whom Michael Henchard sells his wife. Newson was a sailor by profession. He is the one who suddenly, unexpectedly appears into the story. He finds Michael Henchard trying to sell off his wife. He immediately offers the money and takes his wife and the little daughter Elizabeth Jane away. Newson, Susan and Elizabeth Jane all sail to the other country, Canada. They come back. Eventually, Newson is reported dead, which is not true, because Newson, again, just like the formative woman, makes a reappearance in the story, and that is again a surprise. There are always surprises in Thomas Hardy's stories. His stories are sometimes full of suspenses, dramatic turns. So the reappearance of the formative woman, remember, and Newson are quite unexpected. And this is, sometimes we say that fiction is stranger sometimes than life, and this is very much proved by these reappearances of these two characters, the formative woman and Newson. And there are certain rustic characters in the story, as usual, and these rustic characters, through their conversation, through their appearances, or the way these characters are depicted by Thomas Hardy, we get a fair glimpse of this 19th century England, and especially southwestern England, the counties, especially Dorset, which is quite refreshing in the way that in no other novel you find these characters talking in certain almost extinct dialects. Those dialects are hardly spoken these days, but their vocabulary, the way their accent, etc., are very much typical about Hardy's style of presentation. Now, so this was the list of characters, and there are other characters also. I think now this book has got 45 chapters. I propose to read, not read, but just summarize every chapter one after another. But before that, I would like to give you a brief idea of the story. I haven't made any special slide for this brief story, but I will just tell you the story in brief. The first point to remember is Henchard's sale of his wife Susan. Michael Henchard sells his wife in an inebriated means intoxicated condition. He comes, you must have seen the first slide. In the first slide, he comes with his wife looking for a job, and his profession, as described by the author, is the job of hay trusser, Hay, hay trusser, Trusser, hay trusser. He looks for a job in the rural England, and in one camp, when he is very much inebriated, he takes formity with rum. He just falls victim to his own irresponsible behavior of over drinking, and in that state he sells off his wife, auctions her wife. That is a great mistake that he repents later on. Then, when the next day when he wakes up, he understands what a grave mistake he has done, and he then takes his oath. He knows that the drinking, this bloody drinking, has caused havoc in his life, and he says to himself that he's not going to drink for the next 21 years. Why 21? Because at that time he was 21 years of age. So 21 more years, 1 year for every year that he has lived on this earth, and he keeps his vow till the end. Now the next portion, when we jump after that oath taking, we directly plunge into a chapter which takes place after 18 long years. So there is a long gap of 18 years, and in those 18 years the characters are not described. What Michael Henchard was doing, we do not know. What other characters like Susan or Newson were busy in, we do not know. Thomas Hardy takes his readers back to the story after 18 years. Susan comes finally to Casterbridge with her daughter. The daughter is of course a grown-up child now, and when they arrive, they find Michael Henchard, the mayor of Casterbridge. Now in these years, Michael Henchard has grown into a very prominent figure, and he is a successful merchant and also happens to be the mayor of the town Casterbridge. And then we come across another character, a young Scotchman. His name is Farfrae. He is also looking for some kind of an occupation, engagement. He has a very sharp eye for agricultural produce, and he is very quick in arithmetic. He finds himself in Casterbridge. He talks to Michael Henchard. Michael Henchard gives him a proposal of a job of his manager, which after a good deliberation he accepts. And Farfrae starts looking after the business, the estate of Michael Henchard. Then is another episode, Susan. When Michael Henchard comes to know that Susan is in Casterbridge with the daughter, Michael Henchard, weaves a plan. Michael Henchard secretly meets his estranged wife Susan and gives her a proposal of marrying her. And nobody should know that Susan is actually a divorce, is not divorced but was a sold off wife. So this secret must remain buried in their hearts, and even Elizabeth Jane, the daughter, should not know that this Michael Henchard is the real identity of Michael Henchard. Elizabeth Jane has only been told by her mother that Michael Henchard is a distant relation of them. And then Henchard, then comes another character. Actually, this character was kept in the backdrop, and this character's name is Lucetta. Now, something happened between Lucetta and the mayor, Michael Henchard, but that love affair is only in the backdrop. We do not know much about it. We all know that Lucetta eventually decides to settle and install in Casterbridge. She had her own events in her life, so eventually she decides to settle in Casterbridge. Then, through many events, Henchard also starts falling out with Farfrae, his manager, and Farfrae also, he feels very insulted, but he rises little by little in his career, and he becomes he becomes an actual rival in business of Michael Henchard. Meanwhile, Susan also dies, and Susan leaves a letter for Michael Henchard, and in that letter Susan reveals the secret. And the secret is that Elizabeth Jane, this Elizabeth Jane, is not the Elizabeth Jane of Michael Henchard. Michael Henchard's Elizabeth Jane, that is the real daughter of Michael Henchard, died soon after Susan left Michael Henchard. This girl is actually, was actually fathered by Newson, the person who purchased Susan. And Susan actually decided to name second daughter after her first daughter, that is Elizabeth Jane. But this secret is finally revealed to Michael Henchard. Of course, you can understand when any person comes to know about such a terrible thing, then what kind of reactions he must have shown. Michael Henchard is a very seasoned man, but he is heartbroken, because he knows that by this time this Elizabeth Jane, the young lady, a beautiful young lady, is not his own daughter. His own daughter passed away years ago. She couldn't even survive her infancy. Now the Formative Woman. You have already been introduced, the Formative Woman. Formative Woman reappears in the story by a strange event, a court case, etc. And then far from it, your woman not only just recognizes Michael Henchel in an assembly of jury members, etc. Actually, she was put on a trial for some other offense, but also she reveals one of the well-guarded secrets of Michael Henchel, and the secret is that this fellow is not as clean as he often appears. Michael Henchel is guilty of selling off, auctioning off his own wife and his own baby girl. The moment this fact is revealed to people, this news spreads like wildfire in a small place like Casterbridge. And of course, again, this is another jolt to Michael Henchel's life. Michael Henchel suffers great losses in his business. He makes predictions go all wrong, and he becomes a broke. Then Lucetta, who had some love letters under her possession, which were all written by Henchel, that love affair also, the stories, the very spicy stories, become public. Then, little by little, there is an event in the story, and the event of Skimity Ride. Skimity Ride means the moment Lucetta and Michael Henchel's love story was made public, the people, the rural folk of Casterbridge decided to insult Lucetta by just, taking her effigy, parading her effigy on one evening, and that was good enough to take the life of poor Lucetta. And Lucetta passed away. And then comes another character, Newson. Newson, the same man who purchased from Michael Henchel his wife and his daughter Jersey. Newson somehow comes to know that in this small place, Casterbridge, lived his wife Susan and his daughter Elizabeth. He comes to inquire about them, their whereabouts, but he is told a lie by Michael Henchel. Michael Henchel tells him that they are gone. He cannot find. So Newson goes back home. Then by this time, Henchel is also a broken man and a broke. He leaves Casterbridge. He finds himself in a remote corner of the county. And after the death of Lucetta, Farfrae decides to marry Elizabeth Jane, the daughter of Michael Henchel. And finally, Elizabeth Jane and Farfrae decide to meet Michael Henchel in a small lodgings. And in the last part of the story, the poor fellow Michael Henchel dies. And here ends the story. This is the story in brief, a tragic story, a sad tale of a man who makes a mistake. But you see, the subtitle of the story is a man of character. This is the subtitle of the story. Mayor of Casterbridge is the title, and the subtitle is Man of Character. So the story could be seen and interpreted the way you like. It is a sad story, just like any other story of Thomas Hardy. Almost all the stories of Thomas Hardy are very sad, melancholy. Nature plays a very important role in his stories. Anyway, we will look into those areas as much as possible through my presentations. For today, I think it is good enough. Thank you, all of you. We'll meet next day with of course, I shall carry on with my next slides, and I shall discuss the episodes of the novel one by one. Thank you once again.